Hello, I'm Keith Hockton, author, historian, and host of Rearview Mirror Chronicles, where we take a look back at the people and the moments that shaped our world through history. Hello. People often say the Bible was written roughly over a period of 1,500 years, and broadly speaking, that's true. But even that doesn't quite capture how strange and sprawling and accidental the whole thing really is. The Bible isn't a single book in the way most people imagine. It's actually a library, a civilization in paper form, a collection of voices, if you like, echoing across deserts, empires, prisons, battlefields, and ruined cities over more than a millennium. Some parts of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible may reach back as far as around 1400 BC, though scholars can argue for hours, sometimes years, over the actual dating of individual texts. And before anything was written down, many of these stories almost certainly traveled orally, passing from generation to generation beside campfires, inside temples, around family tables, through wandering tribes and fractured kingdoms. Stories carried in memory long before they were ever carried in ink. Then history began battering them. Kingdoms collapse, Jerusalem falls, people are dragged into exile, empires rise from the dust and vanish back into it again. Yet somehow these texts survive, edited, reshaped, stitched together, copied by hand, and preserved through catastrophe after catastrophe. In many ways, the survival of the Bible is almost as extraordinary as the contents themselves. And then suddenly the timeline changes completely. When you arrive at the New Testament, history accelerates. Most of those books are actually written within about 50 years, somewhere between AD 50 and AD 100. That's astonishingly compressed when you think about it. Paul's letters usually come first, written before the Gospels themselves. Real letters, written to real communities scattered across the Roman world, trying to hold together this strange new movement before it tore itself apart. Traditionally, around 40 different authors are said to have contributed to the Bible's 66 books, and the range of people involved is as extraordinary as the book itself. There were shepherds, there were kings, there were fishermen, priests, prophets, poets, scholars, and, believe it or not, tax collectors, men writing from deserts and royal courts, from prison cells and occupied cities. Some highly educated, others probably anything but. And despite being written across such an enormous stretch of time, certain themes keep returning, almost like ghosts moving through the centuries. Power, exile, suffering, justice, redemption, betrayal, survival, and of course hope. Again and again, humanity seems to ask the same questions in different ages with different empires standing overhead. Whether you approach the Bible religiously, historically, or simply as literature, it's difficult not to be astonished by its sheer scope. And even something as simple as the phrase, the Bible, becomes more complicated the closer you look. The familiar Protestant version contains 66 books, but Catholic and Orthodox traditions include others entirely, which immediately opens another fascinating question. Who decided what counted as scripture and who didn't? Why were some texts preserved while others were pushed aside? And once you start pulling at that thread, you find yourself entering one of the most politically charged arguments in religious history. Because the people behind the New Testament weren't medieval Europeans sitting in candlelit monasteries somewhere, in England or Germany, which is how popular culture unconsciously imagines them. Christianity begins much, much further east, out on the turbulent edge of the Roman Empire, in lands that we now call Israel, Palestine, Syria, Turkey, and Greece. Jesus of Nazareth himself was a Jew living under the Roman occupation in Judea, moving between places like Nazareth and Jerusalem. The earliest disciples were mostly Galilean Jews, ordinary working men from fishing villages around the Sea of Galilee. Fishermen, laborers, tradesmen, not aristocrats debating philosophy beneath marble columns. Far from it, but people living hard lives under the shadow of Rome. Their daily language was Aramaic. Hebrew remained the language of scripture and religion, and all around them there would have been Greek, because the Eastern Mediterranean had been shaped by Greek culture ever since the conquest of Alexander the Great centuries earlier. Even Rome itself, in many ways, was living in a Greek intellectual world. Then along comes Paul, and suddenly Christianity explodes outwards. Paul comes from Tarsus, in what would now be in southern Turkey. And Tarsus was no remote frontier outpost. It was incredibly wealthy. It was sophisticated. It was a Greek-speaking city plugged into the Roman Mediterranean world. So Paul would have grown up standing between civilizations, Jewish in religion and identity, yet deeply fluent in Greek philosophy and Roman culture. And that matters enormously because it helps explain why Christianity spreads with such astonishing speed. Paul can move between the worlds. He can speak to the Jews in synagogues and Gentiles in Roman cities. His letters travel along Roman trade routes and sea lanes from city to city across the Mediterranean. Corinth, Ephesus, Thessalonica, and Rome itself. What begins as a tiny Jewish movement in an occupied corner of the Middle East suddenly starts becoming something much larger, something international, something Rome itself would eventually struggle to control. The gospel writers themselves are far harder to pin down than most people realize, because we don't actually know with certainty who physically wrote the texts. Church tradition, of course, gives us names: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but historians still debate the details fiercely. What we can say is that the Gospels appear to emerge from different corners of the Eastern Mediterranean world. Mark, for instance, is linked to Rome and also Syria. Matthew may have come out of a Jewish Christian community around Antioch. Luke feels deeply connected to the wider Greek-speaking Eastern Mediterranean. And of course, John is traditionally associated with Thespius in modern Turkey. What's remarkable is not just where Christianity began, but how quickly it spread. Within only a few decades, small, different Christian communities had appeared across the Roman world. In Corinth, in Alexandria, in Antioch, and of course eventually in Rome. And all of this traveled along the Roman roads, the Roman shipping lanes, and through the shared Greek language that bound the empire together. In many ways, the Roman Empire became Christianity's accidental delivery system. But the Christianity we know today is far narrower than the chaotic world of early Christianity. Most people today grew up with, I think, a fairly fixed image of Jesus. I know I certainly did. He was the gentle Sunday school Jesus, the healer, the teacher of kindness, the man who cured the blind, healed the sick, and made the lame walk. But in the earliest centuries of Christianity, there were many different versions of Jesus competing for attention, and many different competing for survival. Modern scholars even use that phrase, early Christianities, which sounds at first like one of those deliberately difficult academic terms, but it reflects something very real. There was no single unified Christianity in the beginning. There were rival groups, rival texts, rival ideas about who Jesus was, what he meant, and what kind of religion this was going to become. And some versions of Jesus were far, far darker than the one most people actually know today. One of the strangest appears in a text called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. And it was probably written sometime in the mid to late 2nd century AD, perhaps around AD 140 to AD 180. And despite the title, it was almost certainly not written by Thomas the Apostle himself. And keep in mind, in the ancient world, attaching an apostle's name to a text actually gave it authority. And this is certainly not the Jesus people encountered in Sunday school. In this particular version, the child Jesus is incredibly frightening and very lethal. At one point, he's playing beside a stream, damming the water like any ordinary little boy would do. Another child breaks the dam. He kicks it apart. And Jesus turns to him and says, "Why did you do that, you ignoramus?" And then the boy withers away and dies. Jesus effectively kills him. In another scene, he strikes down a teacher, and eventually things become so alarming that Joseph reportedly says to Mary, "Don't let him outside the door, because anyone who provokes him dies." And you can see immediately why later church authorities became uncomfortable with texts like this. So the obvious question then becomes, if the alternative versions of Christianity were suppressed, how do we still know about them? Well, partly because some of those texts survived themselves. They simply fell out of favor or were actively pushed aside as the church gradually decided which books belonged inside Scripture and which didn't. But we also know about them because early Christian writers became obsessed with hunting down what they considered heresy. They wrote enormous catalogues attacking rival Christian groups and beliefs. And these works that still survive today are called heresiologies. And honestly, they sometimes sound like Victorian naturalists collecting butterflies. You know, these early church writers actually traveled through the landscape of competing Christian movements, carefully recording what they regarded as dangerous or bizarre beliefs in trying to destroy these rival versions of Christianity. But in trying to destroy these rival versions of Christianity, they accidentally preserved them for history, which is how we know about them today. These heresy hunters cataloged everything. The habits of rival priests, who they often described as filthy and corrupt, the beliefs of competing Christians, which they regarded as absurd and dangerous, and sometimes even insane. And in attacking these so-called heretics, they accidentally preserved fragments of entire lost Christian worlds. Because it's not just the story of Jesus that once looked very different. The story of Mary changes dramatically too. So one of the important texts, which I mentioned before, the infancy of James, also known as the proto-evangelium of James, was incredibly important. In fact, if you've ever sung the Christmas carol, Little Donkey, Little Donkey, Little Donkey, then you've already encountered its influence without realizing it, because there is no donkey in the biblical nativity story. That famous image of Mary traveling to Bethlehem on a donkey doesn't come from the New Testament. It actually comes from this earlier gospel. And what's fascinating is how much detail this text adds to the birth story. The Gospels move through the birth of Jesus remarkably quickly. And in many ways, they seem more interested in his travel arrangements, the censuses and geography than the actual mechanics of the birth itself. But clearly, in the early Christian world, people had questions, difficult questions, particularly surrounding the idea of the virgin birth. The proto-evangelium of James attempts to answer these questions by expanding the story in extraordinary detail. And it goes a little bit like this. Mary and Joseph travel towards Bethlehem with Mary riding the donkey for the first time in Christian literature. Mary suddenly cries out that the child within her is pressing to come forth. Joseph desperately searches for shelter, and eventually they find a cave. Not a stable, a cave. Then, very conveniently, a midwife appears. I mean, that's also incredibly funny, right? Because midwives just don't wander around caves. Or maybe they did in the old days. So Mary gives birth, and afterwards the midwife is astonished. She declares that a virgin has given birth, and she runs outside the cave to tell anyone that she can find, and she finds a woman standing outside the cave who refuses to believe it. And she insists it's impossible and says that she won't accept it unless she physically is allowed to examine Mary herself. So this woman enters the cave, this stranger enters the cave, and it's one of the strangest scenes in all early Christian literature, because Mary then allows this stranger to test her virginity by putting her hand into her vagina. And of course, the moment that she does this, her hand then bursts into flames. And the horrified woman cries out, "It's because I tested the living God. My hand falls away from me in fire." And this text becomes hugely influential in early Christianity. The cult of the Virgin Mary actually owns an enormous debt to this particular gospel. And of course, scholars estimate that around 140 manuscripts of it still survive in languages ranging from Syriac to Greek and to Latin. One historian even remarked that it was almost impossible to overstate its importance to the early church. And yet what's interesting is today, most people have never actually heard of it. And that's part of what makes the early Christian world, to me, so fascinating. So much of what later became traditional Christianity didn't emerge fully formed from the New Testament itself. It evolved slowly through arguments and additions and rival texts, theological battles, and of course, stories that were widely popular for centuries before later generations quietly, conveniently forgot where they had actually come from. And traces of these lost Christianities, they're still faintly visible beneath the surface of modern Christianity. Ideas, traditions, symbols, stories, many of them actually entered Christianity through texts most believers have never ever heard of. And once you start looking at the ancient world in this way, another startling fact emerges. Christianity was not the only spiritual movement competing for attention. The ancient Mediterranean was crowded with prophets and miracle workers and mystery religions and wandering philosophers and holy men. And some of them actually sounded remarkably familiar and very similar to Jesus. And perhaps the most fascinating to me is Apollonius of Tyana. Apollonius was one of the strangest and most mysterious figures, I think, of the ancient world. A wandering philosopher, ascetic, a miracle worker, and a spiritual teacher who lived during the 1st century AD, roughly at exactly the same time as Jesus himself. For centuries, Christians deeply disliked comparisons between Jesus and Apollonius. And even just mentioning him could land you in deep trouble. In fact, there was a period in France, probably around the 18th century, where if you said his name, it would land you in the Bastille. And perhaps that hostility explains why so few people know about his story today. Because when you actually hear it, I have to say, the similarities are extraordinary. Apollonius was said to have been born around the turn of the millennium. So exactly at the time when Jesus was born. His mother was mortal, his father was a god. During her pregnancy, a supernatural being, an angel, reportedly appeared and announced that the child she carried was either the son of God or perhaps a god himself. The accounts vary, but you see where the story's going. As he grows older, he becomes a figure of immense charisma. He's described as beautiful with long hair and flowing linen robes. He lives very simply, he teaches, he heals the sick, he reportedly raises the dead. And eventually, of course, he begins irritating the Roman authorities. He's then placed on trial. His followers fear he's going to be executed, but instead, he mysteriously vanishes from the courtroom itself and later reappears before his disciples. And at the end of his life, he ascends into heaven, accompanied by heavenly voices. Now, look, none of this necessarily means that Christianity copied him or vice versa, because the ancient world was actually full of overlapping religious ideas, miracle traditions, divine men, dying and rising figures, and supernatural birth stories. But what it does show is something historians often emphasize, that Christianity at this particular time didn't look unique. In the ancient world, Jesus was not the only man being presented as a miracle worker with divine origins. He had competitors. There were rivals. There were alternative holy men offering different paths to truth and salvation. Early Christians understood this very, very clearly. And some claimed that Apollonius was literally sent by Satan to deceive humanity. Later Christian writers became more restrained and simply argued that he was nothing like Jesus at all. and pagan philosophers of the time often pointed out the similarities quite openly. A historian is more likely to talk about circumstance, timing, politics, and extraordinary luck, because eventually Christianity caught the attention of one man who mattered more than anyone else in the Roman world, Constantine the Great. And this part matters enormously. And let's just take a quick break, and we'll be back in a second with part 2. Altodomus is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Altodomus, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. Rome had absorbed foreign religions before. The empire was actually perfectly comfortable importing gods from elsewhere, everywhere actually. There were Egyptian cults arriving in Rome, Persian mystery religions spread through the army. Eastern deities, traveled constantly along the trade routes and the military roads. And of course, none of this was seen as being unusual. What made Constantine different was not simply that he embraced Christianity, it was that he ruled for a very long time. His reign was incredibly stable, and of course his sons continued the process after him. So suddenly Christianity was no longer a persecuted sect, meeting quietly in private houses and hidden rooms. It actually had imperial protection, imperial wealth, and imperial legitimacy. And unlike a lot of the older pagan religions, Christianity carried something potentially explosive inside it: exclusivity. The older religions could happily coexist. A Roman would sacrifice to Jupiter, then honor the local gods in Gaul, visit an Egyptian temple, and still consult a Greek oracle without feeling any contradiction whatsoever. The ancient world was actually very used to overlap. Religions blended into one another constantly. Christianity increasingly rejected that idea. It basically said that ours is the only path. And once that exclusivity gained the backing of emperors and bishops and administrators and soldiers and imperial law, the religious landscape of the Roman Empire began changing with astonishing speed. And you can actually see how fragile the entire process still was in the rule of Julian the Apostate. So Julian attempted to reverse Christianization. He didn't like it, and he wanted the old pagan gods brought back. And I think what's interesting is that later Christian writers often portray him as proof that paganism was already dying anyway, that Rome had somehow naturally evolved beyond polytheism. But that interpretation, I think, ignores one crucial fact. And that is that Julian barely had any time on the throne whatsoever. He dies young, around the age of 31, after ruling for less than 2 years. And the Roman Empire wasn't a rowing boat you could suddenly swing in another direction. It was a colossal imperial machine moving across numerous continents. Constantine and his successors had decades to embed Christianity into the structure of the empire itself, into government law, education, patronage, and power. Julian simply didn't. The word heresy is interesting too, because it didn't originally mean what we know it to mean today. It actually comes from the Greek word heresis, which simply means a choice, a school of thought, something a person selected for themselves. And in the classical world, that was perfectly ordinary. Philosophers belonged to different schools. Doctors followed competing medical traditions. Rival ideas actually coexisted side by side. But Christianity transformed the meaning of the word completely. Because if there is only one truth, then the choice itself becomes dangerous. And once choice becomes dangerous, suppression follows naturally behind it. By the 4th and 5th centuries, Roman law codes are filled with punishments for heretics. There are fines, there's exile, there's confiscation of your property, there's loss of jobs, there's definitely public humiliation and expulsion from cities, and of course, sometimes outright violence. And yet, despite all that pressure, alternative Christianities survived far longer than most people realize. In Ethiopia, there were traditions where Jesus performs miracles, completely absent from the Gospels. In Iraq, travelers encountered communities who revered John the Baptist while viewing Jesus as a dangerous sorcerer. And in parts of India, entirely different Christian traditions evolved with radically different teachings and stories. It's a bit like catching glimpses of a lost universe, a reminder that history could easily have unfolded another way. One version eventually won, but it didn't have to be that version, and this is the point that I'm trying to make. And this actually changes how you see the Roman world itself. Julian's greatest enemy wasn't Christianity, it was actually time. And of course, that then leads to another fascinating truth. Christianity didn't simply triumph over paganism. It slowly narrowed itself from within. Out of the many Christianities that once existed, only one eventually emerged dominant, while countless others actually then just faded into silence, surviving only in fragments, in whispers, and texts buried for centuries beneath the sands of history. So the question then begs, why did one version of Christianity ultimately triumph while so many others disappeared? Partly because the form of Christianity that won was extraordinarily exclusive. There were other Christian groups perfectly comfortable reading texts outside what would later become the New Testament. Some absorbed ideas from Greek philosophy. Others blended with local traditions and other beliefs. Some were mystical and deeply symbolic. Others treated the gospel stories as fluid, evolving narratives rather than fixed divine history. So early Christianity was not just one thing. It was a crowded, chaotic world of competing interpretations. But the version that eventually gained power insisted on something far stricter. There could only be one truth. And when you think about that, then everything else, even though it's Christian, becomes heresy. Opponents are no longer rivals in a debate. They become enemies of the truth itself. The rhetoric becomes ferocious, filled with accusations of corruption, of poison, of darkness, of infection, and of course, contamination. And heresy becomes something to root out, to suppress, and to destroy. And of course, once imperial power joins itself to religious certainty, that language then gains terrifying force. It becomes a brutal language, a spiritual infection threatening the health of society itself. And of course, once ideas are seen that way, almost any punishment can begin to feel justified. And 2,000 years later, we are so used to the language of orthodoxy and heresy that it feels almost inevitable. But if you had stood somewhere in the Roman Empire during the 2nd century, you would probably never have predicted that this strange new idea that one religion should entirely eliminate theological competition would one day dominate Europe for centuries. To many people at the time, that thought alone would have seemed extraordinary. But once emperors become involved, the machinery of suppression grows enormous. And one of the clearest examples is the Theodosian Code, the massive 5th century compilation of imperial law. And it's the sort of monumental work that feels physically heavy with authority. Page after page of legislation attempting to regulate belief itself. And buried inside are endless laws directed against heretics. Huge fines measured in gold, confiscation of property, removal from office. Everything that I kind of talked about before, effectively social isolation. And I think what also becomes clear is that persecution doesn't always require execution. Bureaucracy can be just as effective. Bertrand Russell once observed that if you truly want to force people into conformity, you don't necessarily need prisons or torture or public executions. You simply make survival dependent upon holding the correct beliefs. Take away livelihoods, deny advancement, remove status, isolate people socially, and most will eventually bend. Russell actually thought of this as something distinctly modern, but the late Roman Empire understood that principle perfectly well. And perhaps that's one of the most unsettling lessons running beneath this entire story. Power really begins with swords. Most often it begins quietly, with institutions, careers, laws, social pressure, and the slow narrowing of what people are permitted to believe. And if you examine the laws from the 4th century onward, one of the first things the authorities begin doing to so-called heretics is threatening their ability to survive. They lose access to public life. The pressure is absolutely relentless and intensely bureaucratic. And you can almost feel the machinery of the state tightening around them, not always through open violence, but through exclusion, through making ordinary life gradually impossible. And yet, despite centuries of suppression, alternative Christianities, they never vanished entirely. Fragments survived in distant corners of the world like buried ruins breaking through the earth centuries later, giving us fleeting glimpses of how radically different Christianity might have become had history tilted only slightly the other way. And I think what's really interesting is that these survivals are some of the most fascinating of all today because they feel like echoes from a lost religious universe. In Ethiopia, for example, there were traditions containing stories about Jesus completely unknown in Western Christianity, including tales where he resurrects a roasted chicken and sends it flying to the heavens. You know, these are visions of Christianity so radically different from the familiar Western image that it almost feels like stepping into, an alternative history, doesn't it? And of course, when European travelers encountered communities like these, they were often horrified. And there's a wonderful moment as well where a Jesuit missionary in Ethiopia writes almost in disbelief that these people seem to think that they are the correct Christians and everyone else is wrong. And of course, that's precisely the point. Every group believes it's orthodox. John Locke later observed that everyone is orthodox to themselves, and that may be one of the deepest truths in all religious history. From inside any belief system, your version feels natural, obvious, correct. The alternatives appear distorted, dangerous, and even absurd. So for centuries, Christianity preferred to imagine its rise as destiny, something guided entirely by heaven. But historians looking at the same story, well, we often see something far messier and far more human. We see the politics, the geography, the infrastructure, the patronage, the military protection, the timing, and of course, chance. And in many ways, the triumph of one form of Christianity over all the others can look less like fate and very much like serendipity. Because if history had tilted only slightly another way, the entire religious landscape of the modern world would feel alien to us. If Eastern powers had expanded westward more successfully, if different rulers had embraced different versions of Christianity, if trade routes had kind of shifted elsewhere, we may well have inherited entirely different versions of Jesus and entirely different understandings of faith itself. Religion often likes to imagine itself descending from heaven, kind of untouched by earthly affairs. But history actually tells a far more grounded story. Faith definitely travels along roads. It survives only through patronage. It depends on borders being defended, ships crossing seas safely, scribes copying manuscripts perfectly, emperors deciding what deserves protection, and armies enforcing that order. Sometimes the future of heaven is actually decided by extraordinarily earthly logistics. And I love one historian's description of this shift in perspective. For centuries, scholars imagined Orthodox Christianity as a mighty oak tree surrounded by weeds, the weeds, of course, being heresy. But increasingly, historians now see the early Christian world not as one great tree surrounded by corruption, but as a field of competing saplings, many different versions growing side by side until eventually one becomes dominant. Not necessarily because it was destined to win, simply because it did. And perhaps that is the central tension running through this entire story. Believers and historians often look at exactly the same events through completely different lenses. For a believer, the triumph of Christianity feels probably providential. For me, it appears contingent and fragile and deeply dependent on circumstance. But exploring that tension doesn't necessarily come from hostility. It actually comes just from my own curiosity, from recognizing that history is actually stranger and more complex and far less inevitable than we like to imagine. Because these forgotten Christianities are not merely historical curiosities. They're actually reminders of roads not taken, glimpses of alternate worlds that almost existed. This episode of Rearview Mirror Chronicles is brought to you by Entrepot Publishing, the home of independent storytelling. We publish books that celebrate history, art, and the extraordinary people who make life fascinating. You can find our titles and maybe your next great read at entrepotpublishing.com. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.